The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the stained glass windows of St. Teresa's Church, illuminating the intricate designs with a warm, ethereal light. The small town of Crestwood had always regarded the church as a sanctuary, a place of peace and solace. At the heart of this sanctuary stood Pastor Elijah Stoker, a man revered by his congregation for his unwavering faith and boundless compassion. Elijah was in his late 40s. His deep-set eyes carried the weight of years spent offering comfort to the troubled souls who sought his counsel. Today, like every Sunday, he stood at the pulpit, delivering a sermon that resonated with the hearts of those seated in the pews. His voice was calm, measured, and filled with the conviction of a man who believed he was serving a higher purpose. But as Elijah spoke of love, forgiveness, and redemption, his gaze occasionally drifted to the back of the church, where a young girl sat alone, her head bowed. Abigail Marlowe was a regular at St. Teresa's, a quiet, unassuming 17-year-old with dark hair that hung in loose waves around her pale face. She was known to be shy, often keeping to herself, but her presence at every service had not gone unnoticed by Elijah. The church had become Lila's refuge. Elijah had noticed her first as just another troubled soul in need of guidance. He had seen the way she lingered after services, her eyes searching for something, or someone, to fill the void in her life. He reached out to her one Sunday after the congregation had dispersed, offering her a kind word and a listening ear. She was hesitant at first, but over time, Elijah's gentle approach began to break down the walls she had built around herself. They started meeting regularly after services. At first, their conversations were about faith and life, with Elijah offering Lila advice and support. He would tell her that God had a plan for everyone, even for those who felt lost and abandoned. But as the weeks went by, their conversations grew more personal. Elijah found himself drawn to Lila in a way that was both unexpected and unsettling. There was something about her vulnerability that awakened a deep, almost paternal instinct in him. But beneath that instinct lay a darker desire, one that he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. Lila, too, felt a connection with Elijah that she couldn't fully understand. He was kind to her in a way that no one else had ever been. He listened to her, cared for her, and made her feel valued. She began to look forward to their meetings, to the way his eyes softened when he spoke to her, to the gentle touch of his hand on her shoulder as he reassured her that everything would be all right. One Sunday, after the congregation had left and the church was empty, Elijah and Lila found themselves alone in the sanctuary. Elijah approached Lila, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the boundaries of his role as her pastor blurring, the line between spiritual guidance and something more sinister becoming increasingly difficult to discern. "Lila," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want you to know that you're not alone. You're special, and you deserve to be loved." Lila looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with a mix of confusion and longing. She had never heard words like these before, not from someone like Elijah. It was in that moment that the affair began. What started as a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in their relationship quickly grew into something they both knew was wrong but were powerless to resist. They began meeting secretly, in the quiet corners of the church, away from prying eyes. Their encounters were brief, stolen moments that left them both breathless and filled with a mix of guilt and desire. Elijah justified his actions by telling himself that he was helping Lila, that she needed him in ways that went beyond the spiritual. But deep down, he knew that he was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. Lila, on the other hand, was swept up in the intensity of their forbidden relationship, her feelings for Elijah growing stronger with each passing day. As the sun set outside St. Teresa's Church, casting long shadows over the quiet town of Crestwood, a dark secret was taking root within its walls, a secret that would soon lead to unimaginable tragedy. Gregory Shale, the church's janitor for over 2 decades, arrived as he always did, before dawn, with a thermos of coffee in hand and a quiet reverence for the sacred space he maintained. Gregory was a creature of habit, his days marked by the rhythm of routine. But as he approached the church that morning, something felt off. The front door, which he had locked securely the night before, was ajar, its heavy wooden frame creaking slightly in the gentle breeze. A frown creased Gregory's brow as he stepped inside, the echo of his footsteps unusually loud in the stillness of the empty church. When he reached the door to Elijah's office, Gregory noticed it was slightly open. His hand hesitated on the doorknob, an inexplicable dread filling his chest. But Gregory was a practical man, and he pushed the door open, his breath catching in his throat at the sight that greeted him. Pastor Elijah lay on the floor, his body twisted in an unnatural position. His once kind eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, devoid of life. Blood pooled around his head, dark and thick, soaking into the rich burgundy carpet. The room was a mess, papers scattered across the floor, a lamp shattered near the desk, and the smell of coppery blood heavy in the air. For a moment, Gregory was frozen in place, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. The man who had been a pillar of their community, who had offered comfort and guidance to so many, was now a lifeless corpse on the cold floor of his own office. Gregory stumbled back, his hand trembling as he reached for the phone on the desk, dialing the emergency number with shaking fingers. When the police arrived, the small churchyard quickly filled with the flashing lights of patrol cars and the murmur of hushed voices. Detective Nita Raymond was among the first on the scene, her sharp eyes taking in every detail as she stepped into the office. Nita was known for her meticulous nature, her ability to see what others often overlooked. As she surveyed the room, her expression remained calm, but her mind was already piecing together the puzzle laid before her. The body of Pastor Elijah was a grim sight, his blood staining the floor like a macabre halo. Nita noted the signs of a struggle, the overturned chair, the blood-spattered desk, the torn curtain hanging limply in the corner. This wasn't a simple death, it was violent, personal. Whoever had done this had meant for Elijah to suffer. As the forensic team began their work, dusting for fingerprints and collecting evidence, Nita's attention was drawn to a partially burnt photograph on the edge of the desk. She picked it up carefully, noting the image of a man, Elijah, with his arm around a young woman whose face was nearly obscured by the charred edges. It was a curious find, one that hinted at a connection that was yet to be uncovered. Rachel Stoker, Elijah's estranged wife, arrived moments later, her face pale and drawn as she pushed through the throng of people. She had been notified by a neighbor and had rushed to the scene, her mind racing with questions and fears. When Rachel saw the police tape and the solemn expressions of the officers, her knees buckled, and she would have fallen had it not been for Gregory, who caught her just in time. Her eyes filled with tears as she realized the truth, Elijah was dead, and nothing would ever be the same. The news of Pastor Elijah's death spread through Crestwood like wildfire, leaving a trail of grief and confusion in its wake. St. Teresa's Church, once a beacon of hope and faith, was now the site of a grisly murder. The town was left reeling, its residents struggling to reconcile the image of their beloved pastor with the violent end he had met. As Detective Nita Raymond watched the scene unfold around her, she knew this case was going to be anything but straightforward. There were secrets buried here, secrets that had led to a man's death, and it was her job to unearth them, no matter the cost. Detective Nita Raymond stood in the dimly lit office of St. Teresa's Church, the gravity of the scene weighing heavily on her. The discovery of Pastor Elijah Stoker's body had sent shockwaves through Crestwood, and now it was up to Nita to uncover the truth behind his untimely death. As she surveyed the room, her sharp mind began to piece together the initial clues, but she knew this case would require more than just a keen eye, it would demand a deep dive into the hidden lives of those closest to the pastor. The first step in the investigation was to establish a timeline. Nita needed to know when Elijah had last been seen alive and who had been with him. According to Gregory Shale, the church janitor, he had locked up the church around 9 p.m. the previous night. Elijah had told Gregory he would stay a little longer to finish some work, which was not unusual. But by morning, Elijah's body had been discovered, cold and lifeless. Nita's next task was to interview those who had known Elijah well. Rachel Stoker, Elijah's estranged wife, was a natural starting point. The relationship between Elijah and Rachel had been strained for years, with rumors circulating in the town about their marital issues. Nita met Rachel at the Stokers' modest home, where the atmosphere was thick with tension. Rachel was a woman in her early 40s, with a tiredness in her eyes that spoke of years of unhappiness. As Nita questioned her, Rachel's answers were measured, almost rehearsed. She admitted that she and Elijah had been living separate lives under the same roof for the sake of appearances. They had grown apart, and their marriage had become little more than a formality. I knew he was distant, but I never imagined something like this would happen, Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. He was still a good man, despite everything. Nita noted the way Rachel spoke of Elijah, with a mix of sadness and resignation. But there was something else too, a bitterness that hinted at unresolved anger. Rachel had an alibi for the time of Elijah's death. She had been at a friend's house across town, a fact that was quickly verified. Still, Nita couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel was holding something back. Next, Nita turned her attention to Abigail Marlowe, the teenage girl who had been spending an unusual amount of time with Elijah. Lila was brought in for questioning at the local police station, her small frame dwarfed by the cold, sterile surroundings. And she kept her eyes lowered, avoiding Nita's gaze. Lila, I know this is difficult, but I need to understand your relationship with Pastor Elijah, Nita began, her tone gentle but firm. Lila hesitated, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. He was just helping me, she said softly. I didn't have anyone else to talk to. What kind of help? Nita pressed, her gaze unwavering. Lila looked up then, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and something else, something that Nita recognized as guilt. He was kind to me, Lila admitted. He listened when no one else would. We became close. How close? Nita's voice was calm, but she could feel the tension in the room growing. Lila swallowed hard, her face pale. We had a relationship, she whispered, the words barely audible. But it wasn't like that at first. I didn't mean for it to happen. Nita leaned back in her chair, absorbing the weight of Lila's confession. The relationship between Elijah and Lila was a critical piece of the puzzle, one that complicated the investigation further. This wasn't just a case of a murdered pastor, it was a web of secrets and lies, with Lila caught in the center. As Nita continued her questioning, it became clear that Lila had been deeply affected by her involvement with Elijah. She was young, vulnerable, and had clearly been manipulated by a man in a position of power. But whether Lila's relationship with Elijah had driven someone to murder him, or whether Lila herself had a darker role to play, remained uncertain. With the initial interviews completed, Nita knew she was only scratching the surface. There were still more people to question, more secrets to uncover. The evidence collected from the crime scene, including the burnt photograph, hinted at deeper connections and hidden motives. As Nita left the station, her mind was already racing with possibilities, determined to uncover the truth behind the facade of the small town and its revered pastor. The investigation into Pastor Elijah Stoker's murder was gaining momentum, and Detective Nita Raymond knew it was time to zero in on the primary suspects. The first suspect on Nita's list was Rachel Stoker, Elijah's estranged wife. Although Rachel had an alibi, Nita couldn't ignore the simmering resentment that Rachel had harbored towards Elijah. Their marriage had been crumbling for years, a fact that Rachel had admitted during their initial interview. But Nita needed to explore whether that resentment had boiled over into something more sinister. Nita revisited Rachel at her home, hoping to gain more insight into her relationship with Elijah. As she sat across from Rachel in the small, cluttered living room, she noticed the tension in Rachel's posture, the way she twisted her hands in her lap. Rachel, I need you to be honest with me, Nita began, her voice steady. What was your relationship with Elijah like in the days leading up to his death? Rachel's eyes flickered with a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and perhaps a trace of guilt. It was the same as it had been for years, she said quietly. We barely spoke. We were like strangers living under the same roof. Did you ever confront him about the other women? Nita asked, watching Rachel's reaction closely. Rachel's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly composed herself. I knew he was unfaithful, she admitted, her voice laced with bitterness. But I didn't have the strength to confront him. I suppose I just learned to live with it. Nita nodded, taking in Rachel's words. The bitterness was real, but was it enough to drive Rachel to murder? Nita wasn't convinced. Rachel seemed more resigned than vengeful, more heartbroken than angry. Still, Nita made a mental note to keep Rachel in the loop of suspects. The next person of interest was Abigail Marlowe, the teenage girl who had been having a secret affair with Elijah. Lila's confession had shocked Nita, but it had also raised more questions. How had a vulnerable young girl like Lila become involved with a man like Elijah? And what had driven Lila to continue the relationship, even as it clearly weighed heavily on her conscience? Nita arranged to meet Lila's parents, Harold and Abigail Marlowe, to get a better understanding of Lila's home life. The Marlowes were a devout couple, well known in the community for their involvement in church activities. When Nita arrived at their home, she was struck by the stark contrast between the Marlowes' outward piety and the troubled daughter they had raised. "Detective, I don't understand how any of this could have happened," Abigail said, her voice trembling as she poured tea for Nita. "Lila was always such a good girl. We raised her to be respectful, to follow the teachings of the church. But did you notice any changes in Lila's behavior over the past few months?" Nita asked, accepting the cup of tea. Harold Marlowe, a stern-looking man with deep-set eyes, frowned deeply. "She became distant," he admitted. "We thought it was just teenage rebellion, you know. She started spending more time alone, didn't want to talk to us as much. We had no idea she was involved with Pastor Elijah." "Do you think Lila could have hurt Elijah?" Abigail asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nita considered the question carefully. Lila was emotionally fragile, and her relationship with Elijah had clearly taken a toll on her. But Nita wasn't ready to jump to conclusions. "At this point, we're exploring all possibilities," she said diplomatically. "But it's too early to say." As Nita left the Marlowes' home, her thoughts were focused on Lila. The girl had been manipulated by Elijah, that much was clear. But had she been desperate enough, or pushed far enough, to take his life? Or was there someone else who had discovered the affair and decided to take matters into their own hands? The final suspect on Nita's radar was Marcus Pritchard, a deacon at St. Teresa's Church and a close friend of Elijah's. Marcus was known for his strict moral code and his unwavering dedication to the church. But there had been whispers in the community that Marcus and Elijah had clashed over certain issues that had remained hidden from the public eye. Nita decided to pay Marcus a visit, meeting him at the church office. Marcus was a tall, imposing man with a stern expression that rarely softened. As Nita questioned him about his relationship with Elijah, Marcus's answers were clipped, his tone defensive. "Elijah and I had our disagreements," Marcus admitted, his voice cold. "But nothing that would lead to this. I respected him as a man of God, despite our differences." "Did you know about his relationship with Lila?" Nita asked, watching Marcus's reaction closely. Marcus's expression darkened. "I suspected something was going on," he said, his voice tense. "But I didn't have proof. If I had known, I would have confronted him. What he did was a betrayal of everything we stood for." As Nita left the church, her mind was buzzing with possibilities. Each of the suspects had a motive, a reason to want Elijah dead. But the question remained, who had actually done it? And why? The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but the picture was far from complete. Detective Nita Raymond sat in her car, the engine idling as she reviewed the evidence collected so far. She knew she was close, too close to overlook any detail. The suspects had motives, but something crucial was missing, a piece that would link one of them directly to the crime. That's when it hit her, the burnt photograph found near Elijah's body. It had been dismissed initially as an oddity, perhaps a remnant of the church's clutter, but now it took on new significance. The edges of the photo were singed, but Nita could make out a pair of hands and the corner of a distinct bracelet, a bracelet she had seen before. Nita drove straight to the Marlowe residence. When Abigail Marlowe opened the door, Nita's eyes immediately went to the bracelet on her wrist. It was the same intricate, silver design from the photograph. "Mrs. Marlowe, I need to speak with you and Lila immediately," Nita said, her voice carrying the weight of authority. In the living room, with Abigail and Lila seated nervously before her, Nita presented the partially burnt photograph. "This was found near Pastor Elijah's body," Nita explained, watching their reactions closely. Abigail's face paled, her hand instinctively covering her wrist. "Why do you have this photograph, Mrs. Marlowe?" Nita pressed. Abigail hesitated, her voice trembling as she spoke. "It was, from a counseling session," she stammered. "Elijah kept it as a reminder, but I don't know how it ended up like that." Nita knew she was on the right track. "Did you know about the affair between Elijah and Lila?" she asked directly, her gaze shifting between mother and daughter. Abigail broke down, tears streaming down her face. "I suspected it," she admitted. "But when I confronted Elijah, he denied it, said it was just innocent mentoring." Lila, who had been silent, finally spoke, her voice shaking. "Mom tried to burn the photo that night after they argued," she revealed. "She said it would end everything, but I didn't know what she meant." Nita's mind raced. The burned photograph was the key, proof that Abigail had confronted Elijah. The confrontation had likely escalated, leading to violence. Nita could see it now. Abigail, overwhelmed by betrayal and anger, had lashed out, the rage overtaking her rational mind. "Abigail," Nita said softly, "did you confront Elijah again after that night?" Abigail's shoulders slumped, and she nodded slowly. "I went to the church," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to hurt him, but he wouldn't listen, he kept denying it, lying to my face. I just lost control." With that, Nita knew she had found her killer. Abigail Marlowe had taken justice into her own hands. The truth was devastating, but it was also the final piece of the puzzle. With Abigail Marlowe's confession in hand, Detective Nita Raymond moved quickly to secure a warrant for her arrest. The news of Abigail's arrest spread rapidly through the small town, sending shockwaves through the community. The woman known for her devout faith was now facing charges for the murder of Pastor Elijah Stoker. The trial began within weeks, drawing intense public interest. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman driven to madness by the betrayal of her husband and daughter, arguing that Abigail's actions were premeditated. They presented the burnt photograph, the confrontation at the church, and her own confession as irrefutable evidence of her guilt. The defense, however, argued that Abigail had been pushed to the brink by Elijah's manipulation and deceit, claiming that she had acted in a moment of temporary insanity. They portrayed her as a victim of emotional abuse, someone who had simply snapped under unbearable pressure. The courtroom was tense as the jury deliberated, weighing the evidence and testimonies. When they returned with a verdict, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. "Guilty," the foreman announced, his voice resonating through the silent courtroom. Abigail Marlowe was sentenced to life in prison, her once respected life shattered by the crime. For Detective Nita Raymond, it was a bittersweet victory. Justice had been served, but at a heavy cost. The conviction of Abigail Marlowe sent ripples through the town, leaving a community struggling to reconcile with the truth. A Truth in Crime Case Solvers. Interested in more real-life murder mysteries? Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. Do you have any thoughts about this case or have a case of your own you'd like us to investigate? Leave us a comment. Until then, stay safe.